Hi everybody, welcome to my channel, Life, Law, Fin. Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's awesome to see you guys again. And I do have a very special guest here with me. His name is Samuel March, and he is a barrister at Nine Kings Bench Walk and the founder of Hemp and Hemp Wigs. And Hemp and Hemp Wigs was nominated for the Sustainability Initiative of the Year at the Bar Pro Bono Awards. And if you're interested in what Samuel is doing now, he's developed his practice in criminal and regulatory law with a growing niche in animal protection law. Wonderful to have you here, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I always start with a nice fun fact about our guest, and he is the first person to wear a barrister's wig made from hemp. And we're going to get to know all about this as we dive into it, as we talk about a sustainable legal profession, and most importantly, his hemp and hemp wigs. So, Sam, it's awesome to have you. We'd really like to know a bit about your journey into the law.
Well, I didn't have any clue at all that I wanted to be a lawyer until I was about 26, coming on, yeah, I was about to turn 26. I'd been working in marketing as a marketing consultant. I spent a lot of my time doing social media consultancy in particular. And I just felt that something was missing. My career wasn't quite the source of meaning and purpose and pride that I wanted it to be. And so I had a think about the things that I was good at, the things that I cared about, the things I thought I might be able to make a living out of. And when I put them all together, advocacy came out very high. And I'd never really thought about actually retraining as a lawyer, and it seemed like quite a big step. But I bit the bullet, went back to university, and retrained as a lawyer when I was 26, 27. Went to the University of Law in London, so did my GDL there, and then took a year working as a paralegal. I worked part time as a paralegal for a criminal defence firm. I also began towards the end of my training paralegaling for Advocates for Animals, which is the UK's first and in fact only specialist animal protection law firm. And then I went back to do the BPTC. I don't know what it's called now. I think maybe the BPC. It seems to change its name every 2 years. Did the BPTC as it was then, and then went straight from that into pupillage.
That's awesome. I always do think that there is some kind of wealth of knowledge and benefit to be gained from kind of taking that slight detour out of law, bringing in some other skills as well, and knowing how other disciplines operate. Now, you did mention something about animals, and I think this is how we can hone in on it. How did you develop an interest in animal rights law then?
Well, I've always loved animals. I've got two little dogs with me here. This is
Oh,
this is Gigi. Hello, say hello, and this is Titch, living the legally blonde dream with me.
oh, lovely, lovely to be close
Um,
to you.
so I've always loved animals. And about the same time that I decided to retrain as a lawyer, it was a time for me where I was thinking a lot about my life, about the direction it was going in, about how much good I could do, and also how much harm I could do if I wasn't careful. And it was about that time as well that I decided to stop eating any animal products or using or wearing any animal products because I sort of believe that we should extend the concept of personhood, the basic rights that go with that, a right to life, a right to bodily integrity, a right to a certain degree of freedom, to any of our sort of friends on the planet who can feel pain like us, pleasure like us. And so, yeah, pretty much about the same time that I converted to do law, I also decided to go vegan. And I became increasingly interested in animal protection. And the two began to go quite hand in hand because they're both things I was exploring at the same time. And so, whilst I was on my GDL, I got involved with the UK Centre for Animal Law, A-Law, who have a great student group. They do things like mooting competitions, essay competitions. And I also became involved with Advocates for Animals, the law firm, it's a non-profit law firm that I mentioned earlier. So I was writing some blogs and articles for them, and then ultimately ended up doing some paralegal work with them. And through that experience, I realized that there aren't actually very many animal lawyers out there. Animal law has only recently begun to develop as a field in its own right, and it's partly because it spans so many different areas. But with an interest in criminal law that I'd developed on the course, I'd realized very quickly that I wanted to be doing jury trials. I wanted to experience the life of a criminal barrister. But I also wanted to use the skills that I was gaining to help animals. And so as soon as I could, once I qualified, once I found the chambers that worked for me, I began speaking to my clerks about building my practice out in that direction. And so now I do a series of different cases which are the intersection of criminal or regulatory law and animal law. Probably my key niche recently has been defending allegedly dangerous dogs. So there are certain situations, if a dog looks a certain way and is classed as a pit bull type dog or a number of other banned breeds, or if a dog is involved in a bite incident and causes an injury, the starting point where there is a conviction either for a banned breed dog or for a dog dangerously and out of control causing injury is that dog will be killed. And for me, quite a junior stage of my practice, and for someone who considers myself anti-speciesist, so I try not to see the boundaries between our species. It's been like doing capital punishment cases from a very, very early stage in my career. And those are probably the cases that keep me up at night most, because you know that you will have an ordinary length sentencing hearing, maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, to try and persuade a judge to take the unusual course of action to deviate from the starting presumption and to spare an animal's life. So those have been an area of cases that I've really, really got into over the last year. I also do some both advisory work and advocacy on private prosecutions in animal welfare cases. And I've recently been instructed on my first fox hunting trial as well. So there's a real mix of animal protection work, but using the general skills that I'm building in a much broader crime and regulatory practice.
So this is some really interesting work that you're doing. This combined practice of crime and regulatory law and animal rights. But for those viewers who are wondering a little bit more about practice and a typical work week in an animal rights lawyer's perspective, we'd be keen for you to share a bit of insight on that.
Yeah, it's difficult to talk about a typical week, really, because part of the charm of life as a barrister is the fact that, well, very often no 2 days, let alone no 2 weeks, are the same. I mean, if you take last week, it had nothing to do with animals at all. I was case presenting for the Nursing and Midwifery Council in a case about two nurses who were alleged to have stolen gifts donated for Christmas to the children's ward of a hospital. But then if we look a week or two before, I had very much an animal protection focused week. In fact, a dangerous dogs focused week. On the Monday, I'd been in Maidstone Crown Court, where I cracked a trial that I'd been instructed on for some time. And ultimately that pleas were entered and it was kicked off the sentence. But that was a dangerous dogs case where I was representing not the owner of a dog, but the person in charge of the dog, who's been temporarily left alone with a dog that had jumped up and bitten somebody. Then the following day, I was in Crawley Magistrates Court, where I was representing somebody who was looking after 22 dogs, a mixture of dogs that she owned and dogs that she was fostering. And it was a full-time occupation, specially adapted house, fenced off, so several acres of garden fenced off just for these dogs. But one of the dogs had been up for potentially being rehomed, and somebody had come around to visit it. And when she'd opened the door to let them in, one of the other dogs had got out, a slightly more anxious dog, and had bitten this lady. causing quite serious injuries that required 8 days in hospital. I spent quite a lot of time negotiating with the Crown Prosecution Service, and ultimately they agreed that the defendant's level of culpability was very low, notwithstanding that the pain and suffering caused was very high. And we agreed what's called a basis of plea. This was then put before the court, and the court agreed that this was a very low culpability case and agreed to deal with it by what's called a conditional discharge, one of the lowest forms of sentencing, and just a compensation order. So rather than focusing on punishment, focus on just making sure that the person who was injured was paid some money for their pain and suffering. And most importantly, this woman was facing potentially disqualification from owning or keeping dogs. And that would have meant that all of these 22 dogs, many of them already coming from kill shelters, many of them who'd found her as their last chance, they're low on people's adoption list because they're very old, they're a bit sick, they're a bit odd. But luckily, the court agreed that there were no welfare concerns, and she was allowed to keep them. So the dogs live on happily with the defendant in that case. I went pretty much straight from that to a 3-day Crown Court trial in Swindon, where I was representing a man alleged to have been in charge of a Staffordshire Bull Terrier who had jumped up on, and the Crown said injured, 3 police officers. There was no real dispute that this dog had jumped up on, and as a result of jumping up on, left 3 police officers with a combination of light scratches, red marks, or slight grazes. But I was able to argue that the direction that the jury should get is that injury, it means harm that is more than transient or trifling. And that's something which those who study criminal law may recognize from the definition normally given in actual bodily harm cases. And as a result of that, I focused very much on whether these scratches, these grazes, could be called an injury. Would you stop a football match for them? That sort of thing. Just common sense arguments about what we mean when we say someone's been injured. And after a 3-day trial, he was acquitted. And that's quite significant because where an injury is caused, the starting point is that a dog is put down. And so the definition of injury is really important to these cases. And there were no binding precedents. There's still no binding precedent because this was a first instance trial in the Crown Court. But there were no binding precedents for that. So it was an example of where you get to have quite an engaging, unprecedented legal argument in an animal protection case at quite an early stage in your career.
Oh, definitely. And for those of our viewers who are thinking about a career in crime and or regulatory law, do you have any advice for those viewers?
Yeah, I mean, get as much work experience as you can. Reach out to people, even if you don't know any lawyers. I didn't know many lawyers. I just networked. Whether your university does networking events, whether you reach out to people who you think have interesting practices on LinkedIn. I mean, not everyone will reply. A lot of people are just very busy. But I always try and reply if people message me, try and point them in the right direction. If you don't have anything at all on your CV yet, there are virtual internships, or just get down to court. I mean, just go and sit in a court and watch things. And I think if you're at your early stages, there's nothing more valuable than just going and sitting in a really busy magistrates court and watching 20 remand cases or however many they've got in an overcrammed list, and watch the prosecutor do their very, very busy job over the course of the day, and watch all of the different styles of the different defense solicitors and barristers who come in. So your network, get into court. If you're at a stage where you can do pro bono work, but sometimes that comes a little bit later once you've started to gain the skills. Enter competitions, mooting competitions, essay competitions. I mentioned that the UK Centre for Animal Law does both mooting and essay competitions. The UK Environmental Law Association, UKLA, does a very good essay competition, which I think I won in 2017 or 2018, something like that. And it was just a really fun essay question, a chance to do something outside the course, spend a couple of days on it. And if you win these things, they look really good on your CV. So yeah, just get stuck in, go above and beyond what's on the course.
Great advice, Sam. Now we turn to hemp and hemp wigs. What prompted the conceptualization of, the vegan barrister wig?
Well, I mean, the most at its most basic level, it was the lack of inspiring options out there for vegans. There was no way I was going to wear a horsehair wig, certainly not as a vegan, and particularly not as an animal protection lawyer. So I Googled vegan wig, and the only real options that were out there at the time were synthetic, probably petrol-based products, flown over from the other side of the world. There was someone who made them in Australia. I think there are some more options now than there were even a couple of years ago, and I've noticed even since I made a plant-based wig, there's some copycat products out there as well. Um, but certainly when I first Googled it, there was nothing. And I really didn't want a synthetic wig, let alone one flown across the globe. So I thought, well, what can I make one out of? And I was chatting to my dad, who's an artist, and I think back in the day, a little bit of a hippie. And he was saying, well, what about hemp? And I really like that idea because there's already there's a lot of counterculture around hemp, but it's also a really sustainable product that's increasingly moving into the mainstream. And that I think a lot more things would benefit from being built out of. You can make concrete out of hemp, you can make clothes out of hemp, you can make food out of hemp. Why not make a barrister's wig out of it? So I got in touch with a wig maker. I got in touch with a hemp producer, and I just ordered some hemp. We did some tryouts and got the first one made. I was a pupil at the time. When it arrived, I posted a couple of photos on Twitter, and it did some numbers. And I started to realize that it was in, papers from like Times and the Telegraph to the legal papers, legal futures, the papers in Scotland to hemp and cannabis industry papers in the US. It was really getting around. People seemed to be taking an interest, and people started to ask, well, can I get one? And where did you get one? And I just thought this would be a missed opportunity not to make these available for people. Now, they have to be made one by one. It's a very niche market. If you think already that barristers' wigs are niche, to add hemp and vegan barrister wigs to the mix, these are each made individually to order. So they're not cheap, but people who are committed to these, I found, are willing to pay a bit extra to not have any animal products on their head. And any money that I make from this is going to be going to a charity that uses the law to further animal protection, and I'll be confirming which one shortly once I'm in a position to have paid off the initial investment and start donating.
No, Sam, I think this is a wonderful initiative. It is definitely, I think it's genius that you even thought of it. What does the process of production involve?
Um, it's there are very few people who know how to make wigs, particularly barristers' wigs. It's a very niche skill. So I don't have anything to do with the actual making of them. It is a very, very specialized old craft. So there's a handful of people, I won't say who because it's such a small industry, but there is a single master craftsman based in the UK who makes / supervises a few staff in making each one of these wigs to order by hand. And he does that based on hemp that I provide. It's all European hemp. And yeah, so there's a process first because the hemp comes in big spools, unlike horsehair, which comes in quite a different format. First, you have to sort of process the hemp and get it so that it's in the same kind of length that you'd be used to working with horsehair. And then you have to make the various curls, get it to the wig. And ultimately, the product is something that from a distance, it is indistinguishable. I mean, you don't get people looking twice in court. But when you look close up, it's also clear, and I like this, that it's clear that it is a bit different, that it does have a slightly different feel to it. It's got a slightly sort of earthy, natural color to it. and it also is, put it on, it's quite light. It doesn't itch. I've heard other people complain about itchiness. It's never sort of itched. And yeah, I was really happy with the first one, and I think so far people who've bought them have been pretty happy too.
Okay, Sam, you can now add model to your CV. You're modeling that wig quite well. Now, just for the sake of argument, for those who may not quite yet be convinced, what are the advantages of obtaining the hemp-based wig over the traditional horse-based wigs?
I think I mean the first and foremost one is always going to be the ethical point. It's, do you want to use animal products which are taken without an animal's consent? Now, obviously, I'm very, very prepared to recognize the spectrum of animal exploitation is very, very broad. Taking some hair from a horse, in theory, could be done without causing that horse very much pain or distress. Whether or not it's actually obtained in that way is difficult to say. I've certainly read articles about the way that animal hairs are taken for things like violin strings, and it seems in places like that they're very often taken off animal carcasses, and so they are adding value to the practice of owning animals, stripping them and selling them for parts. And I don't believe that anyone, and when I say anyone, I include animals who are persons in their own right. Certainly, in my view, they have all of the components necessary to consider somebody a person. Um, I don't believe anybody is an object to be traded or sold. I don't believe that anybody is an object to have their hair taken from them. Certainly not if they're not being compensated for it, paid for it, consenting to it, and it's just not something that I think a horse can do. So that's the main point. In terms of other advantages, it's difficult to say what's more sustainable, hemp or horsehair, because again, it's difficult to say for all brands where the horsehair is coming from, whether it's a byproduct and so on. But it's certainly an advantage over the other vegan options, which are very often very synthetic products, very often flown across the globe. Hemp is a very environmentally friendly product, carbon negative product. And so there's the ethical advantage over animal products, there's the environmental advantage over other vegan alternatives. And then there's just the fact that it's something a bit different, a bit fun, a bit exciting. And I really liked the idea of hemp over nylon or even over a cotton-based string or something else, because there was something, I don't know, particularly when you're in the criminal courts and defending drug users. There's something that just felt that little bit rebellious about wearing something so closely related to cannabis on my head.
Definitely that kind of bad boy kind of feel with the wig. Now, how can barristers purchase one of these wigs?
As I say, each one's made to order. So it's very much a case of just getting in touch with me. If you search hemp barrister's wig, one of the first things that comes up will be the Hemp and Hemp website. Hemp and Hemp website has my contact details. People get in touch. I send them an order form. They can confirm whether they want a wig tin as well. It's very much on a person-to-person basis because, as I say, they're such a niche or unusual product that I'm not yet in a position to kind of roll them out and make tens or hundreds. But they're there and they're available for those who are committed vegan barristers.
And given that these wigs are about, £600 plus VAT, can a barrister pay for this in installments?
I'm very much hoping to be able to find a way of formalizing that and setting it up. So far, I've tested up. One of my friends has someone who I knew. We set up a system to test it, and that was easy because I friend and I trust her, and I'm just working out how it impacts the cash flow into the business and things like that. In the long term, I'm going to look into maybe some of the more established services that allow people to pay by installments, and see what can be done with them, because I do appreciate that for people just starting, um, it's an outlay. It's always an outlay. I mean, they're not in a different ballpark to traditional wigs from some of the traditional sellers. And I know this is a problem with some of the traditional sellers as well, is that you can't do it in installments. So it's certainly something that's on the horizon.
That's definitely good to know. Now, I read in an article that you no longer travel on planes, so you know I have to ask you about this. Is this part of the way that you practice sustainability? And the most important question, how do you travel if you need to go to another country?
So yes, it's absolutely sustainability related. I I used to work when I was in marketing. I was and communications. I was a communications consultant for a couple of sustainability focused NGOs in Geneva. And it was, I just started to feel like a hypocrite because I was flying back and forward to Geneva all the time, and starting to wonder whether I was doing more harm than good. And so when I moved back here, I decided to stop flying completely. Um, I looked it up, and one relatively long flight is a year's worth of carbon in a sustainable world. I mean, people should be trying to stick to under 2 tons a year, and I mean, very few people do that in countries like the UK, let alone in places like the US. Um, and but yeah, one long flight makes that impossible, or a couple of short flights even within Europe. So I decided to stop completely. And it's not necessarily easy because my parents live in France, on the border between France and Switzerland. So what used to be an hour and a half on the plane is now about between 7 and 9 hours, depending on connecting trains, from London to Geneva, and then back out to France on the other side. And yeah, it's a pain. It takes longer. It's 5 times the price, but it's the price I'm willing to pay. It keeps me in check in terms of, it means I only travel when there's a real need to do so. It's somewhat limiting in terms of where I'll be able to travel in the course of my life, but no more limiting than it was for my grandparents or any generation in the thousands and thousands of generations of human existence before them. People seemed to get by without having to tick every continent off the globe. And at some point, I'm going to take a year out with my girlfriend, and we'll take a train, work our way up through Europe, work our way from Europe to China. There's hopefully, once there's less unrest in the world, um, take the long train that goes through Russia to China, work our way down through China to Thailand, spend a little bit of time in Thailand, and then work our way back depending on where is safe and good to travel based on what's around and available to us then. And so I do think that there's an opportunity to see the world, but it will be traveling rather than holidaying. And I do think that we need to do something to address this general culture that you can fly anywhere in the world just for a couple of days, because it's killing us.
This is really a very interesting perspective. I'm glad that I asked you about it, because I started to wonder to myself, how would you get to certain destinations? And I think it's a worthy sacrifice that you are making, and possibly it's can even be described as quite selfless, because for the rest of us that are jetting around, you are kind of saving us by not going anywhere. But I think it is something that we do have to keep in the back of our minds.
It's certainly not something that everybody will necessarily be able to do. I mean, in order to have a functioning world, we need to have international citizens, people like diplomats, who travel around, people who are connected in order to make um, international business possible where it's necessary, in order to make international relations work. And so there's always going to be some people who need to travel further, and I'm not suggesting that anyone should be cut off from their families, but but absolutely, I think that people who can opt to take a train instead, people who can opt to forego that holiday to the other side of the world, if there's a quite a nice destination within a train journey, it's just something that I'd encourage people to think of. And it feels good living by your values.
Definitely, I do think it's quite encouraging, because you can then start to evaluate whether or not that trip, as you're saying, is indeed necessary. And now that we're talking about sustainability, I myself as an advocate and hopefully getting into pupillage next year, starting in September, I have already started to think about our legal profession and how sustainable it is. As you know, we don't even have to go as far as how much paper we print to carry into court. So do you think that there's a way that the legal professionals, we can reduce our carbon footprint, or even that same paper that I'm talking about?
I think that there's a serious. I think that there are little changes, like the amount of paper that we print, and I'm sure that more courts, like the crown courts, the criminal crown courts, have gone primarily digital, saving huge amounts of paper every year, and I'm sure that other courts could do the same. Um, but those are small changes, and I think there's a serious conversation to be had about the relationship between some of the big law firms, solicitors firms, and commercial barristers, and some of their clients. And it's a conversation to be had carefully and delicately. Everybody is entitled to representation. We don't pick our clients based on the popularity of their causes. I'm not suggesting some massive overhaul of the cab rank rule. Um, but we do make exceptions to some principles. If you look at proceeds of crime legislation, there are forced disclosures in certain circumstances where a lawyer's duties to disclose certain information or to avoid proceeds from crime kick in and outweigh their duties to their clients. And I think there's a conversation to be had about the fact that the climate crisis is at least as worrying as proceeds of crime, and that there are ways that we could make it more difficult, less desirable, or say, or easier for law firms to do something about it when they're acting for clients who are willfully committing ecocide. And there, there, there are quite a lot of contentious debates going on Twitter right now between people who are traditionalists as far as the cab rank rule is concerned, and people who are more willing to criticize. In fact, the cab rank rule doesn't apply to solicitors anyway, but those who are willing to criticize big solicitors firms actively touting for business with ecocidal companies. I think that there are important and sensible conversations to be had there. And there are parallels that could be drawn with some of the legislation that's been brought in about solicitors' duties and proceeds of crime, or other situations in which there's a need to make false disclosures.
And do you think that there are any, practical steps that the legal profession, on a whole, can take in order to become more sustainable? So I know you have helpfully identified that the Crown Court has definitely moved to a more digital kind of space. Do you think there's anything else that we can be doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, take public transport. Barristers travel to different courts every day. If you want to focus on the steps that individuals can take public transport, um, look at the materials that you use, question whether you need to have hundreds and hundreds of printed business cards, or whether some digital form will do. Look at whether you need to print all of these papers, or whether you can move to online with digital bundling. There are certainly these sorts of small steps, but I think transport being a major one. But I think probably if the level where the real impact is made is going to be something larger. It's going to be about the relationship that the legal profession as a whole has with ecocidal companies.
Well, that's it, folks. This was a really interesting discussion that we had here with Samuel March. Sam, thank you very much finding the time out of your busy schedule to have a chat with us and to be featured on the channel.
Thank you very much. Say goodbye, doggies.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Lovely to meet you guys as well. All right, so that's it, folks. It's a wrap, and we'll see you on the next episode of the channel. Take care of yourself. Bye.
Thanks for having me.